So far this week we've talked about population trends, right? We talked, global population, which again didn't really change for a long time, and then really once we saw industrialization and technological advancement really ramped up, right? So not a lot of change from the beginning of human history till about, I don't know, let's say 1800, and then ripping upward from there, and now it's 7.5 billion people. Again, this is a number that should bog your mind. The next video, we spent a little bit of time talking about where all those people are and how that changes over time. So we saw that in more industrialized nations, especially in the case of Europe, and in the case of Europe, population's not growing, right? So we talked about zero population growth. The average fertility rate is about 2.1 babies per mama. That's what we expect when we see zero population growth. So we don't see huge growth in the US, we don't see huge growth in Europe, but in emerging or developing countries, particularly in the continent of Africa, we see a lot of emerging countries where that population has not, that fertility rate has not dropped off and those populations are booming. So those are some of the themes that are going to work into this particular module, and this is about the shape of population, meaning not the shapes of the people. That's for a different health class, I guess. But here we're going to use some things that we call population pyramids, and you can see here this is the beautiful population pyramid for our own United States of America. And what it does is it actually breaks the population up into bins of 5 years, so 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and so on. And then it also differentiates male versus female. You can see male on the left, female on the right, typically blue and pink, or at least in this diagram, blue and pink. And if you added up all these numbers you see around the exterior, you'd get 100%. And so when we start thinking about these shapes, they can actually tell us a lot about the country and the economics of the country. And so that's why we're going to spend some time talking about these. So if we were to go back and look at the US population pyramid, notice that it doesn't just have straight lines, although it is generally fairly cylindrical, or like a cylinder or like a column, right? It's generally columnar. And what that means, or what that suggests, is that if you're born down here in the bottom, right? Down here in the bottom, if you're born, you are probably going to make it to old age. And then at that point, the cylinder kind of tapers off, right? So we see this there's a cylinder, but it kind of has a triangular top or a pointed top, and that trails off, with the natural death rate, right? The oldest people making up the tip of that point. So again, though, looking at the U.S., it's not perfectly cylindrical, meaning if you're born, you don't just perfectly make it on, or the population trends haven't been stable over time. So really there are two specific bumps when we analyze the US population. You notice one that's really kind of from about age 20 to about age 35. This is the lower bump. And then there's another one that's at about age 50 to 60. It probably goes beyond 60, but that's when we start to get into the tapering effect. So we don't exactly see it as we get to the upper portion, because it's kind of tapered off with the natural death rate. But those two bumps are pulses of population, right? Like a snake eating a rabbit, right? Like as you eat that rabbit and it works its way down the snake, we can watch these pulses of population, whether they're positive or negative, work their way through. So the upper one ranged 50 to probably actually about 70, but again, we lose the top of it. That's the generation that we call the baby boomers. Really coming out of the financial good times, the old Leave It to Beaver days, right? The post-World War II generation. High fertility rates, a big percentage of the population. And then when we see the next group down, that's age 20 to about age 35. That's the next population bump. That's the next rabbit working its way down through the snake, and that's the generation that we generally call the millennial generation, right? The people who really kind of came into their own around the turn of the millennium, plus or minus, right? I think they say, the mid 80s. If you're born then, that's kind of the beginning of the millennium generation, or the millennial generation. I just dodged it on the other side. So as residents of the U.S. of A., we're fairly familiar with our own story, right? We know about the baby boomers, we know about the millennials, but those sorts of things, first of all, aren't universal, and these population pyramids are definitely not universal. So when we compare, or when we investigate a population pyramid of what we would call a less developed country, excuse me, you can see here, this is the population pyramid for Uganda. And the first thing you should note is that this one actually looks like a pyramid, right? It's really wide at the base, and it tapers, right? It doesn't go in a column like we saw in the other cases. So here, what that means is there are far more people. The largest group of people in this population is age 0 to 5, meaning there's lots of babies. But it also, in a grim way, suggests that those babies don't have a very high survival rate, right? So lots of people are born, less of them make it to the next bracket of age, which is 5 to 10, and even fewer make it from 10 to 15, and even fewer make it from 15 to 20, and you can see these progressive steps. And so this is a pretty standard population pyramid for what we would call a less developed or a developing country. Well, potentially not developing, meaning there's a lot of problems, right? That they have very high mortality rates, and we're going to see having this pyramid style population diagram really is not the best thing, and we can kind of move away from it. If we compare the Ugandan population pyramid to here, this is the population pyramid of Norway. You can see it looks actually pretty similar to the U.S. one, and even you could probably argue even a little bit more of a column, right? They don't quite have the two bumps, although there are some bumps. I don't know the history of Norway as deeply as I know the history of the U.S., so I don't quite know the generations. But again, this barrel shape or cylinder shape suggests industrialized nation, and then the actual pyramid shape suggests developing nation or less developed nation. There's also some special cases, right? So these, what we've looked at so far are really two end members, two different ends of the spectrum. There are, some areas in between, but also some special cases. So I want to take a look at, here you can see this is the population pyramid of India. And if you stare at it for a second and really think about what that means, it suggests surging population, right? And that falls in line with what we've seen before. So most people in India are young. So there's this massive bubble of young people working their way up. So if we were to think about what this population diagram would look like in 50 years, it probably is going to look a lot more similar to the US or the Norway model, right? So more of a cylinder, less of this kind of looming pyramid. So that would be an example of what we'll hint at a little bit later, what we call a population boom, where you as a nation have solved a lot of the problems that are causing really high infant mortality, but you have yet to curtail fertility, right? So we can solve a lot of the medical issues, a lot of the nutritional issues, but people behave like people, and they still have the same amounts of children, right? Because they have these traditional family sizes. So if you solve the dying children or the infant mortality problem, but you don't solve the fertility problem, you have a population surge. So you can see that's on its way here. China. So China has a really interesting story. You may or may not know about the one-child policy. So this was instituted from 1979 to 2015, where essentially, as a Chinese citizen, you got to have one kid. Rate, and probably the most significant were financial benefits for only having one children, and financial repercussions for having two. And then, as that policy evolved, there were exceptions, and again, you could probably write your doctoral dissertation on the one-child policy in China. But when we look at the population diagram of China, we can see it's got all sorts of weird bumps and nooks and crannies, right? And so you can see folks who are, in their 30s, right, especially mid-30s to about 40. That's the first generation of people that were affected. That's right when these policies went into play. And then you can see that kind of taper off. Interestingly enough, actually, you can see here's a graph that shows both the population and the birth rates in China, and they have some very significant changes, right? So another special case here is Italy, and this is a strange one, right? Notice that it really tapers off at the bottom, which is essentially the opposite of what we saw in the case of Uganda, and that suggests either significantly lower birth rates, so people are just having fewer children and the population is shrinking, or people are leaving, right? If younger people are not finding what they want in that nation and they're hitting the road, you start to see population dwindle, and that's not so awesome for your economy. The last special case we'll look at is that of Russia. And Russia has, well, first of all, that they had severe losses in World War II. We're starting to not be able to see that effect as much because, again, it kind of gets lost in the tapering, the natural death rate. But famously, whether you remember it or not, tearing down the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, I remember it well. Many of you probably weren't born. Many of you also hopefully remember it well. Again, not exactly sure who's out there on the other side of the camera. But you can actually see the economic effect, right? So as the Soviet Union really starts to drop off, right? Again, 1989 and the early 90s are pretty tough times for them. We see that as a negative pulse in their population, which has now essentially rebounded, right? And we're kind of back to business as usual. But that negative pulse, just as our baby boomer and our millennium generation works its way through the snake, that negative pulse will also work its way through the snake, right? Which has all kinds of financial repercussions when you start to think about developed nations, right? So access to medical care and all of those needs change over time, right? So if you build your medical infrastructure to handle a bulb of snake, once you're through that bulb of snake, all of a sudden you have vacant medical complexes because you don't have the population or people aren't sick enough to fill that need. Or you start creating sicknesses, which, again, that's for a late night argument around the campfire. So what I really wanted to talk about, or why I wanted to discuss these diagrams in the first place, is to talk about resource use, right? And so in a country like Uganda, it's fairly low resource use. In a more developed country like Norway or the United States, we see more resource use per capita, remember? So not only the population's larger, but also per capita. And so how we change from a country like Uganda to a country like Norway is really the process that we call demographic transition. Demographic transition is a transition in your demographics, right? Changing from a population that's, lots of babies, more children, and fewer older people, to one that's more of a cylinder or column, right? Where we, essentially, if you're born, you're more than likely to make it to old age. So for this to happen, like I said, I kind of hinted at this earlier, there are really 4 things that we need to address. So first of all, food, right? Famine and just access to basic nutrition is fundamental to thriving as a child, right? Actually thriving as a human, but more specifically as a child. So nutrition, that's the first category. The next thing is another factor that can affect people is disease, right? So once we start to bring in proper trash disposal and kind of keep things clean, then there's less incidence of infection and less incidence of disease. So the second thing that can propel us along our demographic transition is sanitation. So again, sanitation, less bacteria, less interaction with unsanitary conditions, less disease. The next thing, so number 3, is access to basic medical care. So with access to basic medical care, small things medically don't become big things medically, right? So sometimes it's hard for us to compare to that, because most of us have access to basic medical care, right? If you get a certain type of sickness, it's not ridiculous for you to go out and be able to come up with some antibiotics that are going to help you get better. That's not the case everywhere, right? So there's basic medical access. If you break your arm, the chance of that actually being fixed and you being able to work for the rest of your life is much higher in places where we have access to basic medical care. The doctor's office. So the fourth category, and the last one we're going to talk about, is kind of a subcategory, but it's important enough that we talk about on its own, and that's vaccination. So we have the technology to vaccinate against a wide variety of diseases that in many cases can be like terribly devastating. A really good example, so again, at the risk of this becoming dated in the future, so right now there's a small measles outbreak occurring in Washington and Oregon, 40 or 50 cases or something like that. We'll see how it develops. But last year, if you go to the World Health Organization website, you can find that last year there were 100,000 measles deaths on Earth, right? There weren't any in the U.S. because generally we're vaccinated against something like measles. So we get this kind of herd vaccination. If most people are vaccinated, then those diseases don't rip through the population quite as quickly. People still get the disease, but you get a less serious version of it, and you're not as likely to pass that disease on. So really, the four big things that can transition you from Uganda-shaped population diagram to Norway is nutrition, sanitation, basic medical care, and vaccination. So the transition from a Ugandan style to a Norway style is not just a direct transition. There's actually kind of an uncomfortable phase in the middle where you have addressed these problems. I hinted at this earlier, but you still haven't addressed the problem of fertility, right? So in places such as Uganda, every woman may be having, on average 5 or 6 or even 7 children, and a small percentage of those make it to adulthood. So once these problems are solved, the percentage of those children that make it to adulthood is much larger, but there's a traditional value in the way that we have those children. So it takes some time. Turns out it's different in every case. It takes some time for that fertility rate to drop off to the point where you realize, I don't want 7 children because they're all going to live. I mean, I know that sounds terrible in such absolute terms. But if you have 7 children and all 7 of them make it to adulthood, it's incredibly expensive, right? And again, I know that it's always a little bit crass to kind of take human lives and just think about them as numbers. But the truth is, having 7 children is a financial burden. Unless you're a farmer and you just got 7 new employees, right? But that's not true for everyone. So as we see this transition occur, we have a solution for the infant mortality, but we have not yet solved the rate of fertility, right? People are still traditionally having children closer to historic rates. So that is currently what we have in both India and Brazil. So you can see those are side by side here. They're not exactly the same, but India, I think even more so. You get this sense of like looming population, meaning that the older generation had many children per family, but now all of those children are still here, and so the population is going to go through it's a snake eating a cow in a sense. But following the kind of rules of population evolution, we would hope, or we would expect to see the population of India actually ultimately become more of a column rather than this pulse that we have here. So eventually it tapers off, and once you get to that leveling phase, here we can take a second look. This is the U.S. and the Norway ones, two fairly straightforward examples of industrialized nations, where, again, if you're born, you pretty much make it to the end. Okay, so we've got one more video to get through this week, and then we'll start talking about our exam, which is what we're going to do week 5. Again, I'll have some videos that are specifically dedicated to that, and also some emails, so your questions will be answered. All right, well, I'll see you in the next video.